The lawyer laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a diplomatic smile, but a full, genuine laugh that bounced off the mahogany-paneled walls of his high-rise corner office on the 42nd floor. Richard Blackwood leaned back in his leather chair, hands clasped behind his head, watching the old man across his desk as if he were mere entertainment. "Let me get this straight," he said with a smirk. "You believe the United States government owes you money for land they took 60 years ago? And you think I can just march into federal court and demand payment?" He shook his head, reaching for his coffee, the disbelief clear in his voice. "Sir, with all due respect, that's not how the legal system works. You'd need documents, contracts, military orders, correspondence from decades ago, paperwork that simply doesn't exist anymore." The attorney's confidence was unshakable, his assumptions rock solid. But the old man sitting opposite him, Henry Kowalski, didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his weathered hands resting on the clasps of a battered briefcase balanced on his knees. Henry was 87 years old, dressed in a faded flannel shirt and worn work pants, boots caked with memories of long days spent outdoors. Everything about him screamed small-town retiree, someone who probably couldn't afford Blackwood's hourly rates, let alone a complex federal lawsuit. Yet here he was, having traveled from rural Pennsylvania to the heart of Washington, D.C., driven by a quiet determination that no amount of skepticism could shake. The lawyer had expected a routine VA benefits question or a minor dispute, not the story that was about to unfold. Blackwood took another sip of coffee, checking his Rolex impatiently. He had agreed to this meeting as a favor to his secretary, whose aunt had mentioned a veteran needing legal advice. Now, as Henry slowly and deliberately reached for his briefcase, the room held its breath. Whatever lay inside would challenge everything the lawyer thought he knew about law, history, and the truth buried beneath decades of dust. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of it. The law firm of Blackwood, Sterling and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming office tower in downtown Washington, D.C., the kind of building where power lunches happened and million-dollar deals were negotiated over handshakes that meant more than most people's annual salaries. The reception area featured marble floors, original artwork, and furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Everything was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind visitors that they were in the presence of serious legal firepower. Richard Blackwood had built his reputation on high-stakes litigation, corporate mergers, government contracts, international trade disputes. His clients included Fortune 500 companies, foreign governments, and individuals wealthy enough to treat legal fees like pocket change. He had never lost a case worth less than $10 million, and he had no intention of starting now. At 52, Blackwood was the kind of attorney who appeared on cable news shows to discuss Supreme Court decisions and gave speeches at law schools about the intersection of law and power. His suits were custom-tailored, his office overlooked the Potomac River, and his secretary maintained a waiting list of potential clients who were willing to pay premium rates just for the privilege of consultation, which made Henry Kowalski's presence in his office all the more incongruous. The old man had arrived precisely on time for his appointment, carrying nothing but an ancient briefcase and wearing clothes that belonged in a hardware store rather than a high-end law firm. He had introduced himself politely to the receptionist, taken a seat in the waiting area without complaint, and waited patiently while more expensively dressed clients were ushered into conference rooms ahead of him. When Blackwood's secretary finally called his name, Henry had stood up slowly, straightened his shoulders, and walked into the office with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from a lifetime of not asking for much and expecting even less. He had shaken Blackwood's hand with a grip that suggested he was stronger than his age implied, taken the offered seat, and waited for the attorney to begin the conversation. "So," Blackwood had said, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who billed $800 an hour, "my secretary says you have a legal matter you'd like to discuss. Something about the government owing you money." That's when Henry had told his story. Simply, without embellishment, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting something that had happened rather than something he hoped had happened. In 1943, Henry explained, He had been 20 years old and living on his family's farm in rural Pennsylvania. His father had owned 240 acres of good farmland, the kind of property that had been in the Kowalski family for 3 generations. They raised dairy cattle, grew corn and soybeans, and lived the kind of self-sufficient life that was becoming increasingly rare even then. But then the war had changed everything. The Army Corps of Engineers had arrived one day with official-looking documents and serious-faced officers who explained that the government needed the Kowalski farm for a military installation. They were building a training facility, they explained, something essential to the war effort. The family would be compensated fairly for their land, relocated to suitable property, and treated with the respect they deserved as patriotic Americans making a sacrifice for their country. Henry's father had protested, of course. The farm was their livelihood, their heritage, their entire world. But the officers had been polite and firm. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a wartime requisition under the powers granted by Congress. The Kowalski family could cooperate and be compensated, or they could resist and be removed without compensation. The choice was theirs. So they had cooperated. They had signed the papers, accepted the government's promise of fair payment, and watched as bulldozers cleared the fields where 3 generations of their family had worked and lived and built their dreams. They had moved to a smaller property 30 miles away, trusting that the promised compensation would arrive and allow them to rebuild what they had lost. But the compensation had never come. Weeks had turned into months, months into years, years into decades. Henry's father had written letters, made phone calls, visited government offices. He had been shuffled from department to department, told to be patient, assured that the matter was being reviewed by the appropriate authorities. Eventually, worn down by bureaucracy and broken promises, he had given up and tried to build a new life with what little they had left. Henry had joined the Army in 1944, served in the Pacific Theater, came home to a hero's welcome and a family farm that no longer existed. His father had died in 1967, still bitter about the broken promises and lost compensation. His mother had followed 10 years later, taking with her the last memories of what their life had been like before the government had decided their farm was more valuable as a military base than as a home. For 40 years, Henry had tried to forget about it. He had built his own life, worked construction, raised a family, and tried not to think about the injustice that had shaped his childhood and broken his father's heart. But now he was old, his wife was dead, his children were grown and living their own lives, and he had started to wonder whether there might still be time to set things right. So you see, Henry had concluded, the government took our land and never paid us what they promised. I figure with 60 years of interest, they owe us quite a bit of money. That's when Blackwood had started laughing. Mr. Kowalski, the attorney said now, setting down his coffee cup and leaning forward with the patronizing smile of someone explaining basic facts to a child. What you're describing is legally impossible. Government land seizures from World War II were handled through proper legal channels. If compensation was promised, it was paid. If it wasn't paid, there would be documentation explaining why. But either way, any claim you might have had expired decades ago under statutes of limitations. He gestured around his office, taking in the diplomas on the walls, the legal books on the shelves, the expensive furniture that announced his success and expertise. I've been practicing law for 25 years. I've handled cases against the federal government that involved billions of dollars. I know how these things work, and what you're describing simply doesn't happen. The government doesn't just take people's land and forget to pay for it. Henry Kowalski looked at him steadily for a moment, then reached for the clasps on his briefcase. The old leather was cracked and worn, but the brass fittings were still solid, still functional after decades of careful maintenance. He opened the case slowly, revealing contents that were organized with military precision. File folders, document sleeves, plastic protectors containing papers that looked far older than anything Blackwood had expected to see. Henry reached into the briefcase and withdrew a manila folder, thick with documents that had been preserved with the kind of obsessive care that comes from understanding their importance. These are the original papers, Henry said quietly, placing the folder on Blackwood's desk. Everything the government gave us. Everything we signed. Everything they promised. Blackwood's expression shifted from amusement to skepticism as he opened the folder. The first document was a letter dated October 15, 1943, written on War Department letterhead, and signed by a colonel whose name Blackwood didn't recognize. The paper was yellowed with age but perfectly legible, the typeface crisp and official. The letter confirmed what Henry had described. The Kowalski farm was being requisitioned for military use under the War Powers Act. The family would be compensated at fair market value, approximately $8,000, to be paid within 60 days of property transfer. The letter assured them that this was a temporary measure, that the land would be returned to civilian use after the war, and that their sacrifice was appreciated by a grateful nation. The next document was a deed transfer, signed by Henry's father and witnessed by 2 Army officers. It officially conveyed ownership of the Kowalski farm to the United States government, effective November 1, 1943. The language was formal and binding, the kind of legal document that Blackwood recognized as professionally drafted and entirely legitimate. But it was the third document that made Blackwood's hands shake slightly as he held it. A promissory note, signed by the same colonel who had written the initial letter, promising payment of $8,000 within 60 days of property transfer. The note was backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government and included a clause stating that failure to pay within the specified time frame would result in interest charges at the rate of 6% per annum, compounded annually. Blackwood's mind began calculating automatically. $8,000 in 1943 plus 6% annual interest compounded for 60 years. The numbers were staggering. He reached for his calculator, punching in figures while Henry sat quietly, watching the attorney's expression change from skepticism to shock to something approaching awe. "This can't be right," Blackwood muttered, checking his calculations. $8,000 at 6% compound interest for 60 years would be. He paused, staring at the display. Over $200,000. $258,000 for $112, Henry said quietly. "I've checked the math many times over the years." But Blackwood was already reaching for another document in the folder, this one a land assessment report dated 1944. According to the Army Corps of Engineers, the Kowalski farm contained not just agricultural land but also timber rights, mineral rights, and water rights that significantly increased its value. The total fair market value, according to the government's own assessors, was not $8,000 but $32,000. $32,000, Blackwood whispered, his fingers flying over the calculator keys. At 6% compound interest for 60 years, that's over $1 million. Henry shook his head. "You're still not seeing the whole picture." He reached into the briefcase again, this time withdrawing a folder that was even thicker than the first. Inside were documents that made Blackwood's breath catch in his throat. Geological surveys, mineral rights assessments, reports from government contractors who had discovered something extraordinary beneath the Kowalski farm after the family had been forced to leave. Oil. Not just a small deposit, but a significant reserve that had been discovered during construction of the military base. The reports, stamped with official seals and signed by government geologists, indicated that the Kowalski property sat on top of oil reserves worth millions of dollars even at 1940s prices. "They knew," Henry said simply. "The surveys were done before they took our land. They knew about the oil, knew about the mineral rights, knew what they were really taking from us. But they only offered to pay us for farmland." Blackwood was frantically shuffling through documents now, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by the focused intensity of a lawyer who had just realized he was looking at the case of a lifetime. Land surveys, geological reports, production records from the oil wells that had been drilled on the former Kowalski property, government contracts with petroleum companies that had extracted hundreds of millions of dollars worth of oil from land that should have belonged to Henry's family. The base was closed in 1947, Henry continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. "They said it was temporary, remember? That the land would be returned to civilian use after the war. Instead, they sold it to private companies who knew about the oil deposits. Our family farm became one of the most productive oil fields in Pennsylvania." Blackwood looked up from the documents, his face pale. "Do you know what this means? Do you understand what you're sitting on?" Henry nodded slowly. "I understand that my father died thinking he was a fool for trusting the government. I understand that my family lost everything because we believed in doing our patriotic duty. And I understand that it's taken me 60 years to find a lawyer who would take this seriously enough to look at the evidence." "The evidence?" Blackwood was staring at the most comprehensive collection of documentation he had ever seen in a case this old. Not just the original contracts and promissory notes, but decades of correspondence between Henry's father and various government agencies. Letters from senators and congressmen who had promised to look into the matter. Reports from government auditors who had identified the Kowalski case as one of several oversights in wartime land acquisition procedures. There were photographs, too. Pictures of the Kowalski farm before requisition, showing a prosperous family operation with modern equipment and well-maintained buildings. Pictures of the military base under construction, with bulldozers clearing fields where cattle had once grazed. Pictures of oil derricks that had been erected in the 1950s, extracting wealth from land that should never have been taken from its rightful owners. But it was the final document in the folder that made Blackwood's hands tremble as he read it. A memorandum dated 1949, marked confidential, and signed by a War Department official whose name Blackwood recognized from history books. The memo acknowledged that several wartime land acquisitions had been mishandled, that promises of compensation had not been fulfilled, and that the affected families deserved redress. The memo specifically mentioned the Kowalski case, noting that the family had never received the promised compensation and that the discovery of oil reserves on their former property created additional legal complications. The official recommended immediate payment to avoid potential litigation, but noted that the case had been transferred to another department for final resolution. Apparently, that final resolution had never occurred. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the legal implications. This wasn't just a case of forgotten paperwork or bureaucratic oversight. This was systematic fraud on a massive scale. The government had knowingly seized valuable property, deliberately undervalued it, failed to pay even the promised minimal compensation, and then profited from resources they had essentially stolen from American citizens. "Mr. Kowalski," he said slowly, "do you realize what this case is worth? I have a pretty good idea. The oil rights alone. The production records show hundreds of millions of dollars in extraction value over the past 60 years. With proper legal representation, accounting for compound interest and punitive damages." Blackwood paused, calculating. "We're talking about $50 million. Possibly more." Henry nodded calmly. "That sounds about right. But why now? Why wait 60 years to pursue this?" Henry closed the briefcase carefully, the same deliberate movement he had used to open it. "My father tried for 20 years. He wrote letters, made phone calls, visited offices. Every lawyer he talked to told him the same thing you told me 15 minutes ago. That it was impossible. That the government doesn't make mistakes like that. That he must be confused or mistaken or lying." He stood up slowly, his age showing in the careful way he balanced himself. "He died believing he was a failure. That he had lost our family's heritage because he was too trusting, too naive, too willing to believe government promises. It took me 40 years to realize that he wasn't the failure. The system was." Blackwood rose from his chair, his earlier condescension replaced by something approaching reverence. "Mr. Kowalski, I owe you an apology. And if you'll allow me to represent you, I promise you that this case will receive every resource this firm can provide." "What makes you think I want you as my lawyer?" Henry asked quietly. "5 minutes ago you were laughing at me." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Blackwood realized that his initial reaction had revealed everything Henry needed to know about his character, his assumptions, his willingness to dismiss people based on appearance rather than substance. "You're right," Blackwood said finally. "I judged you based on how you looked rather than what you had to say. I assumed that because you were old and dressed simply, your story couldn't be true. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Henry studied him for a long moment. "My father spent 20 years being dismissed by lawyers who thought they knew better than he did. I won't make the same mistake he did. If you represent me, you do it with respect. You take this case seriously from the beginning. And you remember that this isn't just about money. This is about justice for a man who died thinking he was a fool. I understand. Do you? Because this case is going to require going up against the federal government, petroleum companies, and probably a dozen other entities that have profited from what was stolen from my family. It's going to take years, cost millions in legal fees, and face opposition from some of the most powerful interests in the country." Blackwood looked at the documents spread across his desk, then back at Henry. For the first time in his career, He was looking at a case that wasn't just about money or corporate interests or legal precedent. This was about fundamental justice, about keeping promises, about admitting when the system had failed ordinary people who had trusted it to do the right thing. "Mr. Kowalski," he said, "if you'll have me, I'd consider it an honor to represent you. And I promise you this, we're going to win." Henry reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card that was as old and worn as everything else he carried. On it was the name and phone number of another attorney, someone Blackwood had never heard of. "That's my lawyer," Henry said. "Has been for the past 5 years. He's the one who told me to bring these documents to someone with experience in federal litigation. Someone who could handle a case this size." Blackwood stared at the card, understanding dawning slowly. "You already have representation." "I do. But he said I needed to find the right co-counsel. Someone with the resources and connections to take on the government. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by the size of the opposition. And you came here to see if I was that person." "I came here to see how you'd react to an old man with a crazy story. Whether you'd listen to the evidence or dismiss me based on assumptions." Henry picked up his briefcase, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "You failed the first test, Mr. Blackwood, but you passed the second one. When you saw the evidence, you took it seriously. When you realized you'd been wrong, you admitted it. That tells me you might be worth working with after all." He headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. "My lawyer will call you tomorrow to discuss terms. If we work together, you'll get a percentage of whatever we recover. If we don't, you'll get a story you can tell at cocktail parties about the day you almost laughed away the biggest case of your career." After Henry left, Blackwood sat alone in his office for a long time, staring at the space where the old man had been sitting. He thought about assumptions and appearances, about the danger of judging people by their clothes rather than their character. He thought about Henry's father, who had died believing he was a failure when he was actually the victim of systematic injustice. Most of all, he thought about the briefcase full of evidence that had just walked out of his office, and the realization that sometimes the most extraordinary cases come in the most ordinary packages. The next morning, Henry's lawyer called. The conversation was brief and professional. They would work together on the case, splitting fees and responsibilities according to a standard agreement. The federal lawsuit would be filed within 30 days, seeking $50 million in damages plus interest, penalties, and legal fees. 6 months later, the case made national headlines when the government quietly settled for $47 million rather than face a trial that would have exposed decades of similar cases across the country. Henry Kowalski, who had ridden a bus to Washington, D.C. carrying an old briefcase and a lifetime of frustration, became one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania overnight. But for Henry, the money was secondary to something more important. He had kept a promise to his father, proving that the old man hadn't been a fool for trusting the government. He had been a patriot who had made a sacrifice for his country and deserved to be compensated as promised. The day the settlement was announced, Henry returned to the site of his family's original farm. The oil wells were still there, still pumping wealth from land that should never have been taken. But now there was also a small bronze plaque, placed there by the Historical Society, commemorating the Kowalski family and their contribution to the war effort. Henry stood beside the plaque for a long time, thinking about his father and the briefcase full of documents that had finally delivered the justice they had sought for 60 years. Sometimes, he realized, the most important victories take a lifetime to achieve, but they're worth the wait. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who fought for what was right even when everyone told them they were wrong. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.